I work at Mapbox on satellite imagery. If you've ever looked at a satellite map and realized that it's not just the world as it is, it's a human product made out of choices and it's a designed thing, that's what my team does. One of the things that first interested me about satellite imagery was surfing, right? Just panning and zooming and visiting all these different parts of the world in such a smooth way. Sometimes I worry that web surfing is going out of style. Everything is feeds and search, and I like both those things, but I really like surfing. One of the places I go to surf is the Prints and Photographs online catalog of the Library of Congress. There's all kinds of amazing things here. You can just type something into the search box and get all this stuff back. It's fantastic. I particularly like the photos of Sergei Prokudin-Gorsky, who a century ago figured out how to make good-looking color slides. He was a Russian aristocrat, and he came up with this process. Well, he refined this process, and he realized he needed a grant. So he went to the Tsar, Nicholas II, and Nicholas II was like, photography, you say? This sounds fantastic. Tell you what, have a train car full of photographic supplies, ride from one end of my empire to the other, take photos the entire way, come back, and we will have a slideshow. And Prokudin-Gorsky was like, okay. So he did that. He rode all over Russia just about 100 years ago and took photos of all kinds of things. A lot of it is heavy infrastructure, like this sawmill. This particular photo I think is 100 years old this year. They're big, charismatic mega projects in all his photos, or most of his photos, things that the Tsar could be proud of. Here are some workers preparing a cement pour for an enormous dam. There's a lot of resolution here. You can zoom in and you can see how, for example, the wood joins are not what you would see at a construction site now, because the wood was different, the tools were different, the culture of carpentry was different, they had different techniques. There's all kinds of amazing detail in here. Here's a different dam. There are probably 20 or 30 photos just of dams. Here's something that, in retrospect, seems like an early version of the internet. It's an experimental semaphore. They build this outpost somewhere, they put this kind of day-glow orange paddle up there, and they can send one bit of information at a time. Or I guess if they have multiple colors, more than one bit, I don't know how it works. It's the kind of mystery you bump into here. So you can just keep going through photos. Here's another lumber mill. Apparently there are a lot of trees in Siberia, and they wanted to cut all of them down. Sergei's images can seem a little stilted. So this is beautiful, but it's also, no one stands like that, right? Like, it's an amazing photo, but it's the posedest looking thing. And one reason is that he was doing this as a work for hire for the Tsar. So he's cataloging the empire, but he's cataloging an idealized empire. It's not what we would recognize as candid photography. You might know the story of the Potemkin villages. So the Tsar's advisors wanted him to think that things were going better than they were. So they would take him on little tours, but they would show him a village that was carefully chosen and carefully vetted, and they would tell the villagers to repaint their houses and so on, to insulate him from the actual material conditions of the empire. So in a way, these are Potemkin photographs. They're really triumphant in many ways, on many axes, but they show a country that's about to go through an incredibly violent revolution. I can't speak for the political mindset of these particular people, obviously. That's one of the things about looking over a long distance of space or of time. We just have this artifact of them looking like that, and we can kind of guess, what's going on. We can look at the metadata he recorded, like year and month and a village name. A lot of those village names changed over the course of the 20th century because the 20th century, but it's kind of amazing how much you can piece together and how much you can't piece together. So in photos like that one and this one, humanity does come through. There is a quality of candid photography, even though it's not candid photography. This is just a family, at the end of the day, having harvested a bunch of hay. I really like this photo. I'm thinking I might print it out, like as a wall hanging. I actually have a folder of a bunch of ones I'm considering. So even in these really mannered photos, you get a sense of the moment, of what things were like at particular instance in the inaccessible past and at a great distance. The dog napping by a river is another real favorite, especially because it comes as one of two. But I don't know which one comes first. So one day, by this river, there was a dog shifting in its sleep, and I can see that dog, but I don't really know anything else. It's really easy to imagine yourself there, though. You know you're only imagining, but you can imagine. And that ability to connect, even when it's very partial, and even when it's through this kind of Potemkinization, seems wonderful to me. There's a kind of smoothness here, a high resolution, and I mean scan dimensions, but also spectral resolution, resolution of frequencies of light. What makes this a color photograph rather than a monochrome photograph? There are lots of monochrome black and white photos from this time, but this is special because it's color. That smoothness is a technical feature that helps make these images immediate and beautiful to me. But the way you make something always leaves some kind of trace in what you make, right? And that points to the second reason these photos can feel a little stilted. You can see a hint of it up in the top right. Those are riverboats anchored in the river, and they're kind of rainbowy. See that weird color distortion? Let's switch back. The effect is still there. It's different, but the effect is still there. So Prokudin-Gorsky's glass plates, his negatives, look like this. There are 3 sub-images, what in remote sensing we would call 3 bands per image. There's a photo through a red filter, one through a green filter, one through a blue filter, all in one piece of glass. And you combine them, and you get red, green, and blue. This is an RGB image. And around the edges, you get this kind of like op art effect, where there's no image proper, it's just the edges of the negative, and they don't align. I really like those. If I do print that family harvesting hay, it's definitely going to have the edges. It looks kind of like a cheesy Instagram filter, but it's what the cheesy Instagram filter is trying to look like. If you crop them out, it looks like a pretty normal photograph. They're observing either an eclipse or a transit of Venus. I can't remember which one. Or they're trying to. Obviously, they're not, because it's snowing. Good luck. So one of the fun things about really old photography is that, like, now we think of ourselves as being on this resolution ramp, you know, like there's kind of like this Moore's law thing of like, oh, like a newer camera is better. But back then, I guess they hadn't really thought about how much resolution you actually need, so they just put a huge amount in there. They had these giant plates, and they would cover that in photosensitive material, and there are like all these megapixels from 1915, 1910, so you can zoom right in. And here you see more evidence of that color shift. Look at her hat, right? That little tassel. She's holding still, but the little pom-pom or whatever it is on her hat has fluttered in the wind. So the 3 images of it are in different places. The red plate or the red subplate shows the tassel in one place. Then a few seconds later, when Prokudin-Gorsky is like, cranked it and wound it and covered it in a little sheet and like, had his assistant, slide it up or something. In that time, which is just a few seconds, which we know incidentally because he took a few pictures which included the moon. And you know how fast the moon is moving in the sky, right? It makes a circuit in roughly 24 hours. And you know how the angular size of the moon. So you can figure out the rate and therefore the time between the different images. And so we know how fast he was working, even though he only wrote it down once. And it seems like he was probably wrong or exaggerating. So during that time, like while he's cranking this camera, the wind is blowing things around, but everyone is holding still because he's told them to hold still, which is the other reason these look stilted. This is not just like, you hear about the Victorians having like 3-minute photographs where everyone had to look like this because they had to hold perfectly still. This is later. Like they could have done almost what we would consider like a snapshot, but because he had to change the plates, it took forever. So this rainbow is like a tool mark on the surface of the artifact. They make it just a little bit less smooth. I've decided that for this talk, I get to use the word smooth however I want. Here's another example. This is in the cement pour. The boy in the background wasn't able to hold still. There are 3 images of the boy. One boy on a certain day, 100 years ago, at 3 different moments in that day. The image is surprisingly specific, right? Like all that detail, all that richness. But it really falls apart when you look at its closest levels. I really like that quality. So you see this color fringing mostly on clouds and trees blowing in the wind, and on people too young to hold still. And they're little reminders that Prukudin-Gorsky's almost perfect process wasn't perfect. Which brings us to frogs. So this frog is called Mantella coani, or in English, Cohen's mantella, or Cohen's golden frog, or the black golden frog, not black and golden frog, but black golden frog, or the harlequin mantella. Presumably it has local names. They're not recorded on the internet that I could find, and the internet is what I have. It's from just a few spots in Madagascar. Frogs are kind of tragic heroes to me. They're going extinct really quickly all over the world, and it's because they're at the nexus of a lot of the biggest Anthropocene problems: climate change, land use change, global inequality among humans, chronic and infectious diseases, and how we value species and biodiversity and how we think about extinction and loss and what it means to have life go away. So frogs connect a lot of the saddest but also most interesting problems in the world right now. And one of the things that makes them interesting is that we know so little about so many of them. So for example, this is the highest res photo I could find of this frog. There are a couple others that are about this resolution, but they're all blurry and JPEG-y and don't look good on a screen this big. That's part of the interest to me. If you look up this frog, you find things like this. This is the IUCN red list. So when someone says something is endangered, this is the documentation. This is the primary authority for many kinds of animals. You can see there's this kind of like gradient there that goes from not endangered to extinct, and the frog is pretty far down. If you scroll down, you'll see all kinds of details, documentation about how the species is identified from similar species, its past, its conservation history, and its remaining range. So up here, right in the middle, I've highlighted one of the areas it's supposed to still be in, Ontuetra, which I'm almost certainly mispronouncing. So given that, you can follow clues and get stuff like this. This is from a paper on frog genetics. The third line from the bottom says that this place near Ontuetra is actually called Soamazica, which, again, probably mispronouncing, and I apologize. It gives coordinates, but the thing is, biologists don't think about coordinates the way geo people do. They sometimes put typos in them or format them backwards, or they record the nearest time when they happen to use their GPS, whether they were walking or in a Jeep, or they record the point where they got off the road to go to the place instead of the place, or whatever. There's a footnote here that's oh yeah, actually one of these numbers is wrong, and we know it's wrong, but I don't mean to diss biologists, because they're working with imperfect information and they're passing it along. They're doing an okay job. I'm not mad at you, biologists. So given this, I could get high-res imagery of that little area of Madagascar. This is quarter-meter imagery from World War III, the most advanced civilian satellite, and probably in many ways more advanced than the most advanced secret satellites. This is the highest res that we as civilians can legally handle. Anything you see that's sharper is aerial. I spent a lot of time looking at this area in various ways. Eventually I found a video from a field biologist. So one of the things that frogs are dying of is a disease called BT. And this biologist thought there was a chance that bacteria on the skin of these frogs, because BT is a skin disease, might combat BT. It's a really beautiful video. I used it to check that I had the right spot, because the biologist did something very, very kind that I love when people do, which is he took this like situating shot of the horizon. And with the horizon, you can figure out the view shed. And with that, you can figure out where Somazica is, right? So these are on the outside, the top and left. These are just clips from the video, and then I could use those to like figure out like patterns of trees and hills on the horizon. And there's Somazica. He's added a few notes. Like these are his captions. So like on the left, he says these are holes from artisanal gold mining directly next to the site. Artisanal gold mining just means it's a person doing it instead of a company. But it's a sign that there's a lot of economic stress here. Like you're not going out and digging a hole in a river to find little tiny bits of gold unless it's the only thing you can do, basically. And then up on the top right, he says, notice the rock wall to the right. This is where most frogs were found. Which is kind of sad because the people here are impoverished and the frogs are in the open, and all these horribly unethical exotic pet dealers will buy frogs. So for years, people could just go pick up a frog and sell it. And that's one of the reasons the species is going extinct. But that gets to this situation you often see in conservation biology where you kind of want to blame the person, holding the axe. But number one, that's almost never fair to them, and number two, it's not very effective. Like there's no number of people you can scold to make species loss not a problem. Like that's not the answer. So I, did everything I knew how to do about this area, like putting it on OpenStreetMap, which is an openly licensed and extremely comprehensive free world map, kind of like the Wikipedia maps. This is something I do if I find an interesting place and I don't know what the next step is. I put it on the map, and then maybe someone else knows something interesting about that, and when they see that it's on the map, they can contribute. So the imagery helped me understand certain kinds of contexts, but not others. For example, you can't see the frogs because they're quarter-meter pixels, and they're tiny little frogs, which is really silly, but it's also the point. This picture is about the frogs, but it's not the frogs. Here's an earlier satellite photo. To place this in time, this is almost exactly halfway between Prokudin-Gorski's photos and us. It's from the Gemini 12 mission, which was a preparation for the Apollo missions. This is 1966. The guy in the picture is Buzz Aldrin, the second person on the moon. The person taking the picture is Jim Lovell, who was famous for being incredibly cool-headed on this mission and Apollo 8 and Apollo 13. And they're both still with us. Like, Buzz gives talks about Mars exploration. This photo is from living memory, right? There are two people alive who remember this photo being taken, like they were there. Lovell and Buzz, I think, are two of the coolest astronauts, probably up there with Chris Hadfield, who played David Bowie in space. So it's out of focus, but somewhere in the background there is the Arabian Peninsula, which is kind of interesting because it borders the Red Sea, which is a classic case of a rift, two continental plates splitting. Here's another frame from the same roll of film. So you can see Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, and they're just moving apart, and the water comes in. And here's the thing. When this photo was taken, in November 1966, leading geologists' opinions were divided on whether or not continental drift existed. When this photo was taken, There was no consensus on plate tectonics. Living memory. That's really interesting, which I mean is a euphemism for terrifying if you work with images. This photo, and dozens of other ones like it, didn't work. You see photos like this in geology textbooks now specifically to illustrate continental drift. But at the time, all these perfectly good geologists were like, oh, no, I see why you would think that, but no. So not only can't you see frogs because they're smaller than a quarter of a meter square, you can't see the fundamental process of your own field of study if you weren't expecting to. I came across a great quote in this reflection called The Emergence of Plate Tectonics, A Personal View by Edward Bullard. He says, the turning point for opinion in America about continental drift was marked by a conference in New York in November 1966, sponsored by NASA. At this, the worldwide evidence from the magnetic lineations and the earthquake epicenters in the ocean ridges were presented. The effect was striking. As we assembled on the first day, Maurice Ewing came up to me and said, I thought with some anxiety, you don't really believe all this rubbish, do you? So biology got a theory that made sense of why we see different species in 1859 with Darwin, whose tech was a ship. Geology didn't get a theory that made sense of why we see different kinds of rocks until a century later. And it wasn't satellite images. It was mostly Marie Tharp working on ocean ridges. She did a lot of the magnetic lineation and earthquake epicenters I've mentioned here. Her work was notoriously called girl talk until it was proven. So earth sciences are weird. But the point is, Maurice Ewing was one of the leading geologists of his generation. He discovered all kinds of amazing things. He had this fantastic career. He published something like 300, 400 papers. He did deep sea like sediment cores. He discovered and invented all these amazing things. He was an amazing geologist by any standard other than being right all the time. He led a huge number of marine expeditions. And Bullard, who I quoted earlier, tells a more flattering story about him in the same paper. Bullard asked him where he kept his ship, meaning what's the home port of your oceanographic vessel? Woods Hole or San Diego or whatever. But Ewing replied, I keep my ship at sea. This moved me in a way that's hard to define. I found myself getting kind of misty the first time I read it. I don't know if this line hits anyone else the same way it does me, but I think you know the kind of thing I'm talking about, the sort of feeling you get when a piece of art or something really lands. Some philosophers call this zone of feelings affect. It's kind of between physiological responses, like your pupils, reacting to light, and emotions, which are not fully voluntary, but you can kind of process them. Affect is kind of in the middle. The poet Eyeo Hausman had this great line about how he tried not to remember good poetry when he was shaving because it gave him goosebumps and made it hard to shave. That's affect. So it's not like a considered reasoned appreciation. It's something that comes before. I have a lot to say about how to be right with satellite imagery. I can talk about techniques and details and some fun experiments I've been working on with principal component analysis and putting it in an LAB color space and the intrinsic dimensionality of data and the political economy of image interpretation and like all these things. And that was essentially the first draft of this talk. But eventually I asked what I want people to get out of this, and it was the idea that satellite imagery is worth your critical and creative attention, and that it's less about being right and more about keeping your ship at sea, and that you can be the Tsar and Prokudin-Gorsky. Rob Simon and Jenny Odell and Josh Begley and probably other people whose talks I didn't get a chance to go to have spoken here about doing imaginative things with satellite imagery, and I encourage you to look up what they're doing. The affect to satellite imagery connection is well documented as the overview effect. This is something that some astronauts report feeling in space, where they have this quasi-religious experience when they look back at Earth. They describe a sense of connection and peace. And it is kind of overwhelming to see the home planet. It's not exactly joy or contentment or excitement that I feel. It's something that comes before those separate out. It's affect. If you read space literature, the overview effect is kind of fetishized. It's even occasionally presented as the point of looking at Earth, which seems incredibly sad. The point of looking at Earth is that it's Earth, and it's beautiful, and it's home. Like, it's not, you don't have to feel the overview effect. You can just look at Earth. It's good enough. These images are from yesterday night, our time. This is a Japanese weather satellite called Himawari 8. It's in geostationary orbit. It's centered over New Guinea, roughly. Its job is basically to watch for typhoons coming for Japan. So we're back there somewhere. You can think of what you were doing at midnight last night, and this is a picture of that, only Earth is in the way. Himawari 8 is not high resolution in the way that's usually meant. Its pixels are 4 kilometers across, but it's excellent at temporal resolution, frame rate. This is a volcano erupting in Alaska, and there's a frame every 10 minutes. So you can see the ash plume travel. This is actually a very high quality MPEG. I've just made it look kind of grainy like a GIF because I think people are used to experiencing things that way. It's a GIF. I was very lazy. We can look at the limb, which is just jargon for the horizon, and zoom in on some fast-moving clouds. So we've seen this before, this rainbowing, and it happens for exactly the same reason. The satellite takes different colors at different times, composites them, or we composite them into an RGB image. And analogous rainbows show up in lots of places where people are pushing imaging technology. Technically, they're bad data, but I'm kind of charmed by them. I liked the Himawari 8 imagery so much that I made a website about it called glittering.blue. And the site is just a single video of Earth from Himawari 8, a single day looped, sized big enough that you have to scroll to see it. But here it is on one screen. You can see the reflection of the sun crossing the water. The typhoon at top center is Super Typhoon Soudelor. It ended up in Taiwan. You can see a band of clouds kind of across the equator. That's the intertropical convergence zone where the northern and southern hemispheres' weather systems meet. I spent a lot of time tweaking the color on that, trying to make it look right. Turns out it's really hard, because vision is hard. And I've never been to space. And that's one of the intriguing things about it to me, is that it's a picture of something I'm not going to see, just like the Harlequin mantella, the frog. So I spent a lot of time tinkering with it, doing the best I could to make it look as if I were there, sped up, like obviously this is, it was 24 hours and 12 seconds or whatever, but I just wanted it to look right. But I can't go to space, is the thing. I'm too big to be an astronaut, I think. So let's talk to someone who has been to space. Give me just a minute to set up Skype. Hi.
How's it going?
Welcome to Eyeo. We've got a very enthusiastic audience here.
I hear them. Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to be a small part of it. Thanks for inviting me.
Our pleasure. So we've just been looking at some images from geostationary orbit, and we're curious about what it looks like, what Earth looks like from low Earth orbit.
Imagine if you were on a glass-bottom boat that was 1.2 million feet up, and you were going 5 miles a second, so that you could go from Los Angeles to Manhattan in 10 minutes. The world would look way different. When you look at the world out of an airplane window, it's always sort of at an angle and going slowly. And if you look now and you look 30 seconds from now, it's sort of the same. And there's a lot of blue atmosphere in the way because you're at a low angle. But looking straight down from space and going so fast, 17,500 miles an hour, not only is your view of the world clearer, but it's changing so rapidly that the lighting angle changes and the scenery changes and the weather changes. So if you look away for 10 seconds and look back, you're in the next state, and it constantly refreshes. So the view from orbit, I think, is clearer and more personal than you get from an airliner. And it's much more detailed than you get from geostationary satellite. But yet, because of the speed, you still get that global perspective. You go around the whole thing every 92 minutes. Pretty privileged place to see the planet.
That makes sense. Can you talk about how your perception of Earth changed from when you first went up? So you've been on a couple of missions, you spent a long time in space. How it changed over time, not necessarily Earth itself, but your perceptions?
Sure, it's funny. The first time, I mean, if you and I were on the space shuttle and the engines had just shut off, we've now been on a rocket ship for 9 minutes, but we're weightless in space. The overwhelming human urge is to unstrap from your seat, float up, get over, and look out the window. You want to see the world from the new perspective. And at first, it's overwhelming. There's just, you can see, I mean, from overhead Khartoum, you can see where the blue and the white Nile come from, and you can see the mouth of the Nile in the Mediterranean. You can see the whole Nile out the window. It's kind of staggering. Your brain's not used to all that visual information and geographical and historical info. So you look for touchstones. You find yourself looking for things that you already know because it helps you deal with it. And so you actually, the first thing you see normally after launching out of Florida is the UK and then into Europe. And you actually look for things that you know. You go like, hey, there's London. And hey, look, there's Paris. And what's even more comical is I found myself grabbing another astronaut and saying, hey, look, there's Paris. I've been to Paris. Because somehow that made it easier for me to understand. But the next time you come around, you go, hey, look, there's London and Paris again. But look, you can see the Channel, and you can see the cliffs of Dover. And that must be where Stonehenge is right there. And the next time you come around, you look and you see, wow, look how the Isle of Wight is broken off the island. You can see where it broke off. And every time you come around, you see more detail and you get over yourself pretty quickly. And you really start to see the world. It's sort of like in that beautiful glittering blue image of initially you just see the art of it. But after a while, you start to look at the detail. What am I actually looking at? What parts of the world is this? Look at the geography, the geology, the history, the meteorology, but also the beauty of it. And somewhere along the way, you just start to see the whole world that way with a renewed intimacy and familiarity. And then you never look at it the same again.
Wow. I've always been curious, are there situations where you can see motion, say an eruption or a fast-moving thundercloud or something?
Almost never. The world, you're going fast, but the world, by comparison, seems a still life. There were only a couple times, lightning storms. Lightning is crazy from space. Over Indonesia and Malaysia, the storms are huge. And one night coming across there, the storm must have been 1,000 miles long. And I learned that lightning is contagious. Lightning will start at one end, and then like a bunch of old flash bulbs going through a crowd of paparazzi. It would go tuk, 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 and run the whole length of a 1,000-mile cloud as the thunderheads all lit up. So you do see a little motion of that sort. And there was one other time, the Canadian aerobatic team, sort of like the Blue Angels or the Thunderbirds. The Canadian aerobatic team is called the Snowbirds, and they fly with smoke behind the airplane. And they had this great idea. They said, what if all 9 of us were flying line abreast and we all turn our smoke on? Do you think you could see us from space? And I'm thinking, no. But but I said, well, shoot, let's give it a try, because they were practicing out on the West Coast, just north of Seattle, north of Vancouver. And and so it was 3 o'clock in the morning for me, but I got up at 3 o'clock in the morning over Hawaii, floated to the window, and then I'm just waiting for the coast of North America to come up, kind of floating, pretty cool, head down, sort of upside down in the spaceship. But you get in the spaceship when you come down to face the world, suddenly it seems like the world's above you. Your body's more comfortable looking up at the world. So you feel like the world's above you. So I'm looking up at the world, and I could see the coast coming, the mountains. I could pick out Vancouver Island. And then I saw, okay, so there's Long Island, there's Victoria. All right. And I could see where these guys were supposed to be. And I'm thinking, there's no way I'm, not going to work. And suddenly I saw them clear as a bell, this white, because each of them was trailing smoke, this straight line with the white trailing smoke behind from each of them. And so I grabbed a camera and I started to take pictures. And Pavel Vinogradov, one of the cosmonauts, was there with me. He came floating in because he knew this was happening. So the 2 of us, silent, 3 in the morning, are going, holy cow, Boże moi, look at that. Look what's down below us right now. And and you could see them. And then they actually started turning, the big line abreast turn. And so I saw, for really the only time, a man-made motion on the surface of the world, the life of these airplanes turning below me. And I've flown with them, and I am a pilot. And so I knew exactly what it was like to be in that cockpit. And it just made me laugh it's one thing to know there's 7.5 people down there, or billion people down there, but it's another one to see guys that you know actually drawing some skywriting for you. It was a pretty fun moment.
My goodness. So we have time for a few audience questions.
Right. The world is basically 3/4 water. So normally you're looking at the combination of the deep blue of the ocean and the white of the cloud that's above it. So predominantly the world is blue and white. We normally look from the surface through the atmosphere at a great angle. So we're used to seeing blue as the dominant color. The blue from space is mostly because of the water. As soon as you come over the land, then you get all the different contrasts. Some parts of the world, like the Sahara, are orange. Suddenly, or the empty quarter, the whole world turns orange underneath you. And because the windows in the shuttle or the station mostly face the Earth, the whole station glows with the color of the world. So you can sometimes look around, and mostly the whole thing's sort of this drab blue sort of tint because you're over the oceans. But suddenly the whole station starts glowing orange, and you know you're over a big desert. But over the outback, because the outback is both dry but also a huge mineralogical difference, the outback is all the colors of the rainbow. There's reds and purples and yellows as the super dry land there is underneath you. So the outback is gorgeous and like nowhere else. So the oceans and most of the world blue with a bit of white, but the interesting bits over the land, they're all the colors of the rainbow.
Did your relation to ideas of humanity change?
My relation to ideas of humanity. Yeah, I think so, a little bit. If you and I were in that spaceship and we just got to orbit, and we went around the world once, you'd come back like with a perpetual smile on your face because it's such a cool thing, and you get to see the world with such a privilege, that you ride that giddiness maybe for the rest of your life. But if you go around again and again and again, and 500 times, and then 1,000 times, and then 2,000, I've been around the world over 2,500 times. Somewhere in there, um, you stop seeing the world parts of the world you haven't been to as someplace else. You you inevitably see the world for actually what it is, which is one connected ball, and 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 you see the repeated pattern of human habitation everywhere. You see towns that you lived in, and the way it's set up, the standard human habitation pattern. And then 20 minutes later, you're over Africa, and there's a country you don't even know the name of, a town you've never heard of, and it's exactly the same as Iowa. It's just a place down there, and you realize the commonality of the human existence is far surpasses the little frictional differences that we make so much of, and and that seeps into you with sort of an optimism. We're fractious, and we do bad things to each other, but we do an awful lot of good things to each other, and you see that most people are just hoping for the same thing, and a little bit of grace and some joy and laughter and some opportunity and maybe things a little nicer for your kids. That's really what we're all kind of after, and we chase it different ways. But I think the the shared experience of being a human forever soaks into you when you see the whole world that way, and the challenges that face each of us and the way we try and solve those. And you come back, I think, a little more peaceful, a little more aware of just how ridiculous a lot of our territorial squabbles are, and how inevitably and obviously we're in this together.
One more question. All right, this is a great question to end with, Chris. How does looking at satellite imagery compare to the real thing?
How old's your audience? Have you ever picked up
Our
a
audience
Playboy?
is well above any sort of movie R rating, if that's what you're asking.
Have you ever picked up? It's maybe the difference between a Playboy magazine and the real thing. Not that I don't like as much as the next guy, but no, a lot of imagery, of course. Imagery is just an unrealistic representation of reality, no matter how you try and do it. A camera is not real. A camera is a chemical or digital process, and so really is vision. You don't actually experience things. It's just the light is analog and turned into digital, and then somehow interpreted in your brain as a contrast of textures and colors, which then means something to you. It's not a definitive process. It's not like a table of numbers that somehow exactly quantifies something. It's really a very inexact and artistic, personal interpretation of some form of reality. And so some of the satellite images and the pictures that I took from the space station, they do a pretty good job of stimulating that reaction and that thought and that delight. They also give you a perspective you can't get any other way. And when I saw that glittering blue, it's like I've seen lots of satellite photos and I've been around the world a lot, but that interplay of reality, of light and dark and weather and ocean and land and storms, that's a really unusual way to see the reality. And so in fact, it's almost a hyper reality. It lets you then see something that just your eyeball would never be capable of seeing. So it's not the same as being there, not the same as seeing it with your naked eye and allowing your thoughts to run free. But sometimes that's okay. And sometimes, if anything, like good art, it'll stimulate you to see beyond what's just in front of you.
All right, Chris, we're out of time. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you, Charlie.
And thank you, sound people.
Yes.
Hey, I took 150 of my best pictures, put them in this book, and all of my proceeds from this book, it goes to the Red Cross, in the rest of the world. In the U.S., it goes to the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and it's sold a lot of these books. But it was my absolute best effort to answer that question you just asked me. How well can you see the world, and what does it mean to you? So I'm really, I didn't want those pictures to just languish and waste away. So we put this book together, and it might be worth you looking at someday, and the money goes to a good cause. But anyway, thanks for letting me join in today.
Thank
and
you.
I hope to get there in person sometime.
Thank you. Bye, Chris.